What if the first breath a Primarch ever took was not in sunlight, not in safety, not in the warmth of a father's design, but in poison so thick it could kill armies? Mortarion's story begins not with destiny or triumph, but with toxic fog, rotting soil, necrotic winds, and a world that had already surrendered its future to death. Barbarus was not simply hostile. It was a planet where life clung to existence in agony, a place where corrosive mists rolled endlessly across mountains, where the skies were forever polluted, where the shattered remains of lost civilizations lay buried under layers of chemical decay. Into this nightmare fell an infant engineered to be a demigod, a child created by the Emperor, flung across the galaxy by forces no mortal could comprehend. But unlike his brothers who landed on fertile worlds or warrior kingdoms, Mortarion's cradle was suffocation. His first cry was swallowed by the poison air. His first sight was the silhouette of a towering figure standing above him. Nikaer, one of the necromantic overlords who ruled Barbarus from their death-choked peaks. To Nikaer, the baby was not a miracle or a threat. He was a curiosity, a small, pale creature who did not die when the toxic fog touched his skin. This was the first truth of Mortarion's life. He survived what no human should survive, and in that survival lay the seed of everything he would become. Nikaer raised Mortarion not as a son, but as a possession, an experiment to be observed, molded, and used. The warlord locked him in a towering fortress high in the poisonous clouds, far above the valleys where humanity struggled and suffered. From the balcony of that cage in the sky, Mortarion looked down at the world below, a world of greenless fields and dying villages, where armored figures descended from the cloud-wrapped mountains to claim victims for experimentation, torture, or simple cruelty. These warlords thrived on necromancy, alchemy, and unnatural endurance, their bodies twisted into monstrous forms by the toxins they consumed. They ruled through fear, pain, and poison. Mortarion watched them descend like predators, dragging screaming humans back up the slopes. He was told these beings were his kind, and that the creatures below were lesser things, weak, fragile, undeserving of survival. But the more Mortarion watched, the more something inside him rebelled. He did not see monsters in the villages. He saw people who could not breathe the air he breathed. He saw suffering where he was told to see inferiority. And that contradiction gave birth to the first spark of questioning within the boy who would one day command legions. As Mortarion grew, Nikaer taught him the arts of war, the manipulation of alchemical toxins, and the harsh laws of Barbarus. Strength is survival, weakness is death, compassion is foolishness. But Mortarion's exposure to the valleys below planted seeds the necromancer could not uproot. The boy yearned to descend, to meet the humans below, to breathe their air, even though he knew the toxic atmosphere would grow harsher the lower he traveled. Every attempt to escape ended in pain. Each step toward the valleys made his lungs burn, his veins scream, his vision blur. But Mortarion pushed himself further each time, his body slowly adapting, his will sharpening into a blade. The toxic fog became his crucible, shaping him through suffering rather than privilege. He was born a Primarch, but Barbarus forged him into something far more dangerous, a liberator who understood oppression from the inside. One day, Mortarion pushed too far. He descended the mountain until the poison nearly killed him, collapsing unconscious in the upper reaches of the fog. When he awoke, he found himself in a human settlement saved by villagers who, despite their fear, recognized him as something more than a monster from the peaks. For the first time in his life, Mortarion breathed air untainted by necromantic malice. For the first time, he heard voices filled not with contempt but with hope. The villagers taught him what Barbarus truly was. A world enslaved by the warlords who preyed upon them. A planet where humans lived short, brutal lives under the constant threat of death. Their stories ignited a fury in Mortarion that no training could extinguish. He realized he belonged not with the tyrants above, but with the oppressed below. And in that realization, Mortarion found purpose. He would free Barbarus. He would destroy the warlords. He would become the weapon they could never control. Mortarion's bond with humanity grew quickly. He trained the villagers to resist, teaching them the tricks he learned in Necair's citadel. He forged crude armor to survive the poisonous slopes, built weapons from scavenged metal, and formed militias capable of fighting back. The humans of Barbarus rallied around him, their pale champion rising from the fog like a spirit of vengeance. As Mortarion led them up the mountains, his tolerance for the poison deepened. Battles were brutal, fought against necromancers and chemically mutated horrors, but Mortarion pushed his followers upward, ever closer to the peaks dominated by his tyrannical adoptive father. With every victory, Mortarion proved himself not a warlord in training, but a liberator unlike anything Barbarus had ever seen. His legend spread across the valleys as a whispered promise. The child of death would destroy the overlords of death. Yet the higher Mortarion climbed, the more the poison clawed at his lungs. At last, he reached the threshold of Necair's peak, the place where the air became unbreathable even for a Primarch. Here, Mortarion confronted the ultimate truth of his existence. He was forged for greatness, yet even greatness had limits. As he staggered forward, blinded by toxin, Necair descended with mocking laughter. The warlord revealed the final cruelty of Mortarion's upbringing. He had kept the boy in the clouds not out of kindness, but because Mortarion could never survive the highest concentrations of poison that Necair himself embraced. Mortarion realized in that moment that even his liberation crusade had been built on a lie. The lie that he could defeat the warlords alone. Then the sky split with golden light. A figure descended through the toxic clouds with impossible grace, radiance cutting through the poison like dawn piercing a storm. The Emperor had arrived on Barbarus, drawn by the psychic beacon of his lost son. Mortarion, suffocating and on the edge of collapse, watched as this impossible being effortlessly breathed the air that crippled him. The Emperor strode forward, cut Necair down with ease, and looked upon Mortarion not as a stranger, but as a father reunited with his child. And in that moment, when the Emperor robbed him of his vengeance, something inside Mortarion broke. Gratitude and rage collided. Admiration and humiliation fused. The Emperor saved him, yet also proved that Mortarion was not the strongest force on Barbarus, not the liberator he believed himself to be. This fracture, born in deathly fog, would one day grow into a schism that would tear the galaxy apart. Mortarion swore fealty, but not with joy, not with faith, with obedience, with reluctance, with a wound that would never close. His childhood had been shaped by poison and tyranny. His destiny had been shaped by liberation and suffering. And now, at the moment of triumph, he had been rescued by a father he had never known. A father who arrived too late. A father who overshadowed him in every way. From the very beginning, Mortarion's loyalty was cracked. And through that crack, decay would one day seep in. Chapter 2, The Mountain of Death, Mortarion's Escape, the Villagers, and the Birth of a Liberator. What if the moment a Primarch first chose his own path wasn't a glorious battlefield declaration, but a gasping, choking escape through poisonous mist, driven not by pride or destiny but by the simple, desperate need to understand why he felt drawn to the humans below. Mortarion's rise from Necair's captive child of death to the liberator of Barbarus didn't begin with heroism. It began with rebellion. Not rebellion against an empire, but against the lie he had been raised to believe, that the necromantic overlords of the mountain peaks were his kin, and the humans in the valleys were worthless creatures fit only for suffering. As he grew, Mortarion felt a pull he could not explain, a gnawing intuition that the fragile shapes moving far below him were not prey but people. Every time he looked down from the tower, every time he watched Necair's minions descend to harvest their victims, Mortarion sensed truth clawing at the edges of his mind. A truth so powerful it drove him to test the limits of the toxic world itself. His first attempts to descend the mountain were failures so brutal they would have killed any mortal. The poisonous fog thickened the lower he went, burning his lungs, scarring his throat, turning every breath into a torture that threatened to shatter his body. Yet each time he tried, he reached farther than before. His genetics, those godlike building blocks forged by the Emperor, did not give him comfort. They gave him resilience. And resilience was enough. Mortarion could not breathe the poison, but he could endure it longer and longer, carving out strength one agonizing step at a time. These early crawls into the fog became his true education, not the lessons taught by Necair. The pain taught him empathy. The suffocation taught him determination. The glimpses of humanity taught him identity. Mortarion did not descend the mountain seeking freedom. He descended seeking truth, and the truth he found became the core of the man he would become. It was during one of these desperate escapes that Mortarion finally collapsed within reach of a human village. Villagers found him half dead, unconscious, and burning with poison. They could have abandoned him, fearing him as one of the mountain lords. But instead, they acted out of compassion, dragging him into shelter, tending to his body, and offering him what little food and water they had. For the first time in his life, Mortarion was surrounded not by cruelty, but by warmth. Fragile, desperate, impoverished warmth, but warmth nonetheless. When he awoke, he did not see monsters or inferiors. He saw humans, small, weak, terrified, and yet somehow stronger than the tyrants above because they endured without supernatural enhancements, toxic resistance, or necromantic power. Their survival was not based on strength, but on stubborn humanity, and that inspired Mortarion more than any lesson Necair had ever forced into him. The villagers taught Mortarion the history of Barbarus, a story carved into their skin by generations of suffering. They told him of the mountain warlords who descended upon them to take victims for experiments, ritual harvests, and macabre amusements. They told him of ancestors who fought back and were crushed, of crops poisoned by mist, of children who never survived past adolescence, of entire clans lost to the terror of the peaks. As Mortarion listened, rage took root in him. Not a childish tantrum, but a cold, focused fury. The necromancers had lied to him. They were not his kin. They were tyrants feeding on the innocent. He had been raised by his enemy, trained by his enemy, shaped by his enemy. And if he remained silent now, he would become like them. This was the moment Mortarion chose who he was, not a weapon for a warlord, but a liberator for a world that could not liberate itself. Mortarion decided to fight, but he knew brute strength alone wouldn't be enough. Even he could not survive the deepest regions of the fog unprotected. So he began crafting crude but effective armor and breathing apparatuses, designed not for himself but for humans. He forged plates from scavenged metals, sealed joints with tar and leather, built masks that filtered the worst of the toxins, and created weapons heavy enough to break necromantic abominations. The villagers trained beside him, growing stronger under his guidance. Mortarion's genius was not just physical, it was tactical. He understood that to overthrow the tyrants of Barbarus, fear had to be broken first. He led the humans in small raids, ambushes, rescues, skirmishes that pushed the necromancer's minions higher up the mountains. Every victory gave the people hope. Every defeat hardened Mortarion further. He did not fight for glory. He fought because he knew what it meant to be powerless, and he refused to let anyone else suffer that fate. With each ascent, Mortarion became something more than a leader. He became a symbol. The people began calling him the Pale Warrior, a figure born from the poison that ruled their world, yet standing unbowed by it. As their numbers grew, they formed the earliest Proto-Death Guard, a force defined by endurance, unity, and relentless willpower. They were not soldiers. They were survivors who refused to die quietly. Mortarion's philosophy took shape here. Victory through resilience, not privilege. Strength earned through suffering, not birthright. He despised the necromancer's power because it was unearned, poisoned by unnatural gifts. This hatred, this obsession with earned strength, would one day define everything Mortarion embraced and everything he rejected. The battles that followed were brutal, fought on steep slopes choked with fog, against corpses reanimated by arcane energy and monstrous constructs built from human remains. Mortarion pushed himself to lead from the front, often collapsing after fights when the poison overwhelmed him. But each time, he rose again, lungs burning, body trembling, determined to climb higher. The villagers followed without hesitation, inspired not by divine rhetoric or promises of salvation, but by the example of a warrior who fought while gasping for air just like they did. Mortarion was not just their champion. He was proof that even the impossible could be fought. But the closer they got to the upper peaks, the more Mortarion felt his limits. Even a Primarch had boundaries, and Barbarus was a world optimally designed to test those limits. His armor helped, but the air at the highest elevations was lethal beyond measure. His lungs seared with every step, his vision blurred, his strength faltered, and yet he pushed on, not because he believed he would survive, but because he believed the people below deserved freedom more than he deserved breath. Mortarion's crusade was not a march of conquest. It was an ascent toward death, and he accepted that. In his mind, dying in defiance was better than living in captivity. At last, Mortarion confronted the truth he had avoided. Even he could not reach Necaer. He could get closer than any mortal in Barbarus's history, But the final stretch of toxic vapor was too dense, too corrosive, too absolute. He collapsed on the edge of the plateau, gasping in agony. He had fought for years, climbed through poison, shattered warlords, and led thousands, but he was still mortal enough to fail. And just as his vision faded, as death wrapped around him like a shroud, a golden figure descended through the fog, a being untouched by poison, radiant in power, the Emperor of mankind. The Emperor's arrival ended Mortarion's crusade in an instant. The tyrant was slain, the people were freed, and Mortarion was denied his vengeance, denied his final triumph, denied the right to complete the liberation he had earned through suffering. This denial carved a scar deep within him, a wound far more poisonous than any missed on Barbarus. And from that scar, Mortarion's future tragedy began to bloom. Chapter 3: The Emperor Arrives. The duel that shouldn't have happened. What if the moment that forged a Primarch's lifelong resentment, the moment that set him on the path to ruin, was not a betrayal committed by a brother, nor a whisper from the warp, but a single act of mercy delivered by a father he never asked for? Mortarion's confrontation with the Emperor on Barbarus is often retold as a heroic reunion, the godlike creator rescuing his lost son from a monstrous fate. But the truth is far more volatile, far more tragic, and far more corrosive than the Imperial legends ever admit. At the peak of Barbarus, where the poison was thick enough to rot lungs in seconds and the fog glowed with necrotic radiance, Mortarion believed he was finally ready to face Necare, the tyrant who raised him, imprisoned him, tormented him, and lied to him. He had climbed higher than any human had dared, built armor with his own hands, trained thousands to fight, liberated countless villages, and shattered nearly every lesser warlord who haunted the mountain slopes. This confrontation was not just a battle. It was his purpose. Mortarion needed to kill Necare, not only to free his world, but to prove he was strong enough to overcome the force that shaped his entire existence. As Mortarion advanced through the fog, every breath scourged his throat with acid. His armor groaned under the toxic weight. His vision narrowed. His body trembled from the cumulative poisoning he had endured through years of relentless ascents. But he kept walking, driven by the singular goal that defined him, ending the rule of the Death Lords forever. Necare awaited him at the summit, surrounded by swirling clouds of toxin, his monstrous form impossibly tall and armored in alchemic plating that had fused to his corrupted flesh over decades. Necare didn't see Mortarion as a threat. He saw him as a disobedient possession returning home. And with a voice dripping with contempt, he revealed the truth Mortarion had spent his whole life trying to avoid. Mortarion could never reach him. The air was too toxic even for a Primarch. The necromantic warlords had ascended beyond mortality through centuries of adapting their bodies to the poison. Mortarion had been raised in the upper air not to protect him, but to ensure he could never survive the true domain of the tyrants. His entire childhood had been engineered to keep him obedient and dependent. His strength nurtured just enough to make him useful, but never enough to make him dangerous. Mortarion attacked anyway. He swung with fury, desperation, and defiance, but every moment he fought, the poison took more from him. His blows became sluggish. His body screamed for oxygen. His vision blurred into darkness. He could not breathe, could not think, could not stand. The duel that he had dedicated his entire life to lasted seconds before Necare overwhelmed him. Mortarion collapsed on the stone, gasping, choking, suffocating, dying. But even in that final moment, he tried to crawl forward, nails scraping stone, refusing to surrender to the man who had enslaved his world. He reached out not for rescue, but for vengeance. And as his fingers clawed desperately toward Necare, the sky shattered with golden light. The Emperor arrived. To Mortarion, the sight was incomprehensible. A towering figure of radiant energy, walking effortlessly through poison that had suffocated him. The Emperor did not gasp, did not choke, did not stagger. The fog parted before him as though reality itself made way. With a single, perfect motion, the Emperor raised his blade and struck down Necare, ending in an instant the tyrant Mortarion had dedicated his life to defeating. It was the moment Mortarion had waited for, fought for, suffered for, and he was not the one to achieve it. His entire crusade, his years of training, his endless endurance, his burning hatred, it all felt stolen from him in a single heartbeat. To the Emperor, this was salvation. To Mortarion, it was theft. The Emperor reached down and spoke to his son, telling him of his origins, of the gene forging that shaped him, of the destiny that awaited him beyond Barbarus. Mortarion barely heard any of it. His world was collapsing, not because of poison, but because of humiliation. He had been moments away from proving that endurance and suffering could overcome any tyrant. He had been moments away from completing the liberation born from his own blood, sweat, and agony. And now a stranger, a golden giant immune to all that had defined Mortarion's existence, had taken that moment from him. Mortarion's hatred of psychers, already deep from witnessing Necare's necromancy, fused with the humiliation of being rescued and crystallized into something toxic, the belief that the Emperor's power was inherently unjust. Mortarion accepted the Emperor's hand because he had no choice. His people celebrated the Emperor, rejoicing as the last warlord fell. They saw a god. Mortarion saw a thief. When the Emperor proclaimed him Primarch of the 14th Legion, Mortarion bowed. Yet his heart bowed only halfway. A fragment of him, carved by poison and forged in resentment, resisted. He did not feel awe at the Emperor's power. He felt anger that such power existed at all. He had spent his entire life fighting tyrants who wielded abilities far beyond the common man. Now the Emperor revealed himself as a being whose psychic might dwarfed them all. And instead of comfort, Mortarion felt betrayal. The Emperor had become, in Mortarion's eyes, just another overlord, more benevolent, perhaps, but still wielding an advantage Mortarion considered unfair. This was the wound that would define the next 10,000 years. A father attempting to reunite with a son, and a son seeing only the reflection of the tyrants he despised. Mortarion could not articulate this resentment. He did not rage or rebel. He simply carried the humiliation with him like a hidden scar. He trained with the Emperor. He walked at his side. He learned the ways of the Imperium. But inside, the toxin of that moment seeped deeper. Barbarus had taught him that any power not earned was corruption, and the Emperor's psychic magnificence, unquestioned, unchallenged, unreachable, represented the ultimate unearned privilege. The duel that shouldn't have happened, the rescue that wasn't wanted, the reunion that birthed resentment instead of loyalty. This was Mortarion's first true fall, not into chaos, but into bitterness, not into corruption, but into disillusionment. Mortarion swore fealty, but not with love. He followed the Emperor, but not with faith. His loyalty was functional, not emotional. And when a charismatic war master later offered validation, understanding, and brotherhood, it was this hidden wound. The wound opened on the mountains of Barbarus that allowed the rot to enter. The tragedy of Mortarion did not begin with the warp. It began with a single breath he was never allowed to take, and a single victory he was never allowed to claim. Chapter 4, Primarch of the 14, Death Guard Identity, Culture, and the Seeds of Resentment. What if the moment Mortarion took command of the 14 Legion was not the start of redemption, but the beginning of a long, quiet unraveling? An internal decay that started not with chaos, but with pride, shame, and an inherited ideology of suffering. When the Emperor placed Mortarion at the head of the Dusk Raiders, the Legion greeted him with reverence, for they recognized instantly what he embodied: endurance, discipline, and the ability to survive what should kill any living thing. But Mortarion did not see reverence. He saw dependence. Dependence on a father who had saved him against his will, dependence on a gene line he had not chosen, dependence on a role he had no chance to reject. As he walked among the 14 Legion for the first time, he studied their faces, their armor, their training, their history, and realized they were everything he wished he had been: organized, united, respected, and feared across countless battlefields. And instead of filling him with pride, that realization filled him with a cold, lingering resentment. In Mortarion's eyes, even his legion was a gift he had not earned, a gift that reminded him constantly of the power imbalance that had shaped his life. Mortarion renamed the legion the Death Guard, imprinting upon them the philosophy forged in his suffering on Barbarus: that war was not about glory or spectacle, but endurance, not about brilliance, but attrition, not about psychic miracles, but about the resilience of the human form and will. He stripped away anything he considered excessive. Ornate armor? Removed. Ritualized traditions from Terra? Discarded. Symbolic displays and banners? Now meaningless. Mortarion believed the Imperium indulged in vanity, and vanity was weakness. The Death Guard would be different. They would wear armor built for survival, not beauty. Fight with brutal efficiency, not ceremony. March through storms of poison and hail and fire without complaint. He shaped them into a legion defined not by strength, but by the ability to withstand what would break all others. They became his unbroken blades, warriors whose identities mirrored the bleak, punishing worldview he had carried from the mountains of Barbarus. His disdain for weakness became their creed. Mortarion demanded that every recruit, whether born from the Legion's original Terran stock or from the hardy survivors of Barbarus, earn their place through grueling trials. The toxic mists of Barbarus had nearly killed him repeatedly, yet he survived because he forced himself to. To him, that suffering proved something, proved worth. Therefore, he enforced the same logic upon his legion. Recruits were made to endure crushing conditions, starvation-level rations, endless drills, and environments designed to break lesser warriors. Those who survived were hardened, not only physically but spiritually. They internalized Mortarion's belief that life itself was a battle against forces trying to crush you, and only through pain could you discover your true strength. In this way, Mortarion transferred his trauma onto an entire legion, turning personal scars into institutional doctrine. Mortarion's hatred of psychers further shaped the Death Guard. On Barbarus, psychic power was synonymous with tyranny. Necare had used it to dominate him, and Mortarion had seen firsthand how supernatural abilities created hierarchies based on birthright rather than earned merit. When the Emperor openly embraced psychic mastery, it clashed violently with Mortarion's worldview. And now, as Mortarion commanded a legion containing librarians, warriors gifted with the very powers he despised, his resentment deepened. He viewed psychers as walking reminders of everything he hated: unearned power, unnatural advantage, and dependency on forces outside human strength. He imposed strict limitations on them, distrusted them, and often sidelined them. To Mortarion, psychers were tools of oppression masquerading as assets, and this belief would one day be weaponized against him. The Great Crusade offered Mortarion endless opportunities to express his philosophy. He drove the Death Guard harder than any other Primarch drove their legion. They marched through environments that would kill even space marines: acid storms, radiation-choked wastelands, biological hellscapes, and toxic atmospheres. Mortarion believed the Imperium should conquer not with flash or spectacle, but through relentless pressure. Worlds submitted to the Death Guard not because they were in awe, but because they were exhausted. They were worn down. They were outlasted. Mortarion's approach earned results: brutal, efficient, undeniable results. But it also isolated him from his brothers, who saw in his methods a certain bleakness that reflected his internal struggle. Where other Primarchs inspired their legions with hope or strategy or vision, Mortarion inspired with endurance, bitterness, and an unspoken demand to suffer without complaint. The seeds of resentment toward the Emperor also grew during this time. Mortarion chafed at the Emperor's strategic decisions, his use of psychers, his aloofness from the Great Crusade, and his reliance on psychic communication rather than honest speech. Mortarion saw the Emperor's psychic might as fundamentally unfair, a distortion of strength that no mortal and no Primarch could ever hope to match. When the Emperor revealed his plan to withdraw from the Crusade to focus on the Webway project, Mortarion viewed it not as a visionary undertaking but as abandonment. His father had arrived late on Barbarus. Now he was leaving early in the Crusade. The cycle repeated, and Mortarion felt it as deeply as the poison scars etched into his body. The resentment toward psychers, the bitterness of an unfinished childhood vengeance, the trauma-turned doctrine passed down to his legion. These wounds began forming cracks in Mortarion's foundation. Horus saw these cracks, and where the Emperor spoke in riddles and half-truths, Horus spoke plainly. Where the Emperor demanded obedience, Horus offered validation. Mortarion was not swayed by promises of glory or power. He despised those things, but he was vulnerable to brotherhood, to acceptance, to someone who understood his hatred of tyranny and mirrored it. And Horus became the first person in Mortarion's life who treated him as an equal. Not a project, not a weapon, not a disappointment, not a child who needed saving. In Horus, Mortarion found the empathy he had never found in the Emperor, and that emotional connection was the first real chain chaos would wrap around him. The Death Guard themselves sensed these shifting loyalties. They saw their Primarch's disdain for the Emperor's psychic abilities, his grim admiration for Horus' leadership style, his simmering frustration with imperial politics. Yet they followed him without question, because they believed in his creed. Suffering strengthens, endurance conquers, pain reveals truth. In time, they adopted not only his combat doctrines, but his worldview, one that saw the Emperor's luminous might as suspect, and Horus' grounded authority as trustworthy. Mortarion did not know it yet, but his fall had already begun, not in the warp, but in the quiet choices he made every day, in the lessons he taught, in the bitterness he carried, in the resentment he never resolved. Chaos did not create Mortarion's downfall. It simply waited for the rot that was already growing inside him to reach the surface. Chapter 5: Bond with Horus. Brotherhood, bitterness, and the path to betrayal. What if the most dangerous influence in Mortarion's life wasn't chaos, poison, or the nightmares of Barbarus, but a brother who finally gave him the one thing the Emperor never did: validation? Mortarion's closeness to Horus is often framed as inevitability, but in truth it was a psychological convergence decades in the making. From the moment the Emperor rescued him on Barbarus, Mortarion felt a growing distance from his father. The Emperor was radiant, psychic, untouchable, the embodiment of every tyranny Mortarion had fought during his mortal youth. Horus, however, was grounded, charismatic, approachable, and gifted with a talent Mortarion craved more than raw power: the ability to truly understand others. When Mortarion first marched beside Horus during the Great Crusade, the experience was transformative. Here was a Primarch who did not belittle Mortarion's trauma, who did not dismiss his methods, who did not shame him for his aversion to psychic abilities. Horus respected Mortarion's endurance-based philosophy and saw value in it. For the first time since Barbarus, Mortarion felt seen, not as a project to be improved, but as a brother whose suffering had shaped a powerful worldview. Horus admired the Death Guard's relentlessness, even integrating some of their attrition-based strategies into his own campaigns. He praised Mortarion's tactical brilliance, calling him unstoppable, unbreakable, incorruptible. These labels fed Mortarion's deepest insecurities. After years of silently resenting the Emperor's overwhelming power, Horus' words struck like balm to old wounds. Mortarion began to lean on Horus emotionally, trusting him as a partner in war and as a confidant when it came to his frustrations with imperial hierarchy. During council meetings, Horus often defended Mortarion's blunt manner or abrasive critiques, framing them as honesty rather than insolence. Horus gave Mortarion something no other Primarch ever could: a sense of belonging. And in return, Mortarion gave Horus the one thing he rarely offered anyone: loyalty rooted not in duty, but in personal connection. Yet beneath this brotherhood lay a shared grievance that bound them more tightly than friendship: their mutual discomfort with the Emperor's secrecy and psychic power. Horus did not despise Psykers as Mortarion did, but he did resent the Emperor's distance and cryptic nature. Mortarion, hardened by years of seeing psychic abilities abused by tyrants, saw the Emperor as dangerously similar to the necromancers of Barbarus, wielding powers beyond comprehension with little explanation for why others should trust him. Horus sympathized with Mortarion's perspective and encouraged him to voice his concerns. In private, they lamented the Emperor's lack of transparency, his withdrawal from the crusade, and his refusal to explain the larger vision. Mortarion felt that the Emperor's silence was betrayal. Horus convinced him that this silence was proof of hypocrisy, and slowly, subtly, Mortarion began shifting his center of gravity away from the father he mistrusted and toward the brother who understood him. Their bond deepened across hundreds of campaigns. Horus often visited the Death Guard, sharing victories and philosophy with Mortarion's captains. Mortarion, who rarely praised anyone, spoke highly of Horus in return. The 14 Legion came to see the War Master as one of the few Primarchs Mortarion respected. Horus saw the Death Guard as the perfect instrument for prolonged warfare, an army designed to endure the unimaginable, built for sieges, attrition, and grinding battles of will. Their synergy as commanders was undeniable. Mortarion admired Horus' strategic brilliance. Horus admired Mortarion's unshakable discipline. This mutual admiration created a gravitational pull that became harder for Mortarion to resist, especially as his resentment toward the Emperor grew. But the most dangerous moment came during the Council of Nicaea, when the Emperor forbade the use of psychic librarians, a decree Mortarion should have celebrated. Mortarion saw the Emperor not as principled but as inconsistent. The Emperor himself wielded psychic power yet demanded others restrict theirs. Mortarion's hatred of hypocrisy flared. Horus comforted him afterward, agreeing that the Emperor's decisions felt contradictory. That conversation, quiet as it was, planted the seed that Horus, not the Emperor, was the wiser leader, the one more in tune with the needs of the legions. Mortarion's bitterness deepened not because he was weak, but because Horus amplified emotions Mortarion already carried. When Horus fell at Davin, Mortarion was not swayed immediately. His distrust of the warp was too strong. He despised demonic influence, but he could not ignore his brother's transformation, nor could he ignore the growing belief that the Emperor had abandoned the crusade and left the legions rudderless. Mortarion confronted Horus not as a loyalist or traitor, but as a brother demanding answers. And Horus, ever the master of persuasion, framed his rebellion not as treachery but as liberation. He claimed the Emperor was creating a new form of tyranny, one hidden behind secrecy and psychic manipulation. He insisted the legions were being used, discarded, misunderstood. He played directly into Mortarion's Barbarus-forged worldview. His hatred of overlords, his distrust of psychic power, his resentment of injustice. Horus didn't corrupt Mortarion with promises of power. He corrupted him with the illusion of equality. Mortarion did not embrace the rebellion instantly. He resisted. He questioned. He doubted. He despised chaos and distrusted the warp. But Horus offered something the Emperor never had, a role where Mortarion could lead without being overshadowed, where his hatred of Psykers was validated rather than dismissed, where his belief in hardened strength was praised rather than seen as excessive. Horus positioned himself not as a superior, but as an ally, a brother continuing the mission the Emperor had abandoned. And Mortarion, exhausted from a lifetime of bitterness, finally accepted this narrative, not because he wanted to betray the Imperium, but because he wanted to stop feeling like a pawn in someone else's story. In truth, Mortarion's fall didn't happen during the heresy. It happened years earlier, on war councils, in quiet talks aboard starships, in moments where Horus treated him as a man rather than a tool, a brother rather than a disappointment, an equal rather than a mistake. When Mortarion finally sided with Horus, it was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of relief. Horus had become the family he wished the emperor had been. And in that tragic emotional shift, that human longing for recognition and understanding, the seeds of Mortarion's ultimate damnation were planted. Chapter 6: The Warp Trap, Destroyer Plague and Mortarion's Breaking Point. What if the moment Mortarion finally surrendered his soul wasn't a grand declaration of allegiance to darkness, not a roaring vow shouted to the warp, but the quiet, suffocating collapse of everything he believed about strength, endurance, and control? For all his hatred of psychers, all his disdain for witchcraft and warp-born power, Mortarion still thought the universe could be endured with enough willpower. Pain in his mind was a teacher. Poison was a crucible. Suffering was proof that you were still fighting. So when the Death Guard fleet drove into the storm of unreality during the Horus Heresy, he didn't flinch. He trusted the same creed that had carried him through Barbarus. The warp, he believed, was just another hostile environment, another version of toxic clouds and necrotic winds that could be outlasted by discipline and iron resolve. He thought he could march through madness the same way he had marched through poison. He was wrong. The warp is not terrain. It is a living, laughing, hungry thing. It does not merely exist. It reacts. It remembers. It shapes itself around fear and doubt, and Mortarion carried more of both inside him than he was willing to admit. The first signs of the Destroyer Plague were small enough to ignore. Cough inside a sealed helm. A warrior pausing half a step too long as mucus burned in his lungs. Filmy residue building in air filters that normally shrugged off industrial toxins with ease. Mortarion dismissed it as warp interference, a nuisance to be endured. The Death Guard had marched through chemstorms, biocontagion zones, and radiation fronts that would have liquefied other legions. They had waded knee-deep through sludge that ate armor and stripped flesh from bone. The 14 prided themselves on never faltering, never retreating, never showing discomfort. So when the first plague symptoms appeared, their response was to grit their teeth and push harder. But this sickness was not like anything they had faced before. It didn't just attack flesh. It invaded identity. Armor seals became slick with pus that regenerated when cleaned. Rebreathers clogged with clotted phlegm a moment after being purged. Marines vomited into their helmets and then kept fighting because they knew no other way to live. The Death Guard tried to outlast a disease that wasn't testing them. It was claiming them. As the ships drifted deeper into the warp, reality itself grew thick and stagnant. Time jittered. Hallway distances stretched and contracted. Lights flickered with an organic rhythm, as though the vessels themselves were breathing. In that oppressive unreality, the Destroyer Plague bloomed. It became a presence, a personality, a malignant fog with intent. Space Marines whose gene-forged bodies had shrugged off centuries of environmental abuse began to bloat and crack. Bones softened and clicked wetly when they moved. Their legendary resilience turned against them, slowing their deaths but stretching their pain. They were not dying quickly. They were rotting alive. Apothecaries tried every remedy they knew, antitoxins, chems, even controlled auto-immolation of infected tissue, but nothing worked. Every cure fed the plague new data. Every attempt to excise it only taught it how to grow stronger. For the first time since Barbarus, Mortarion watched his people suffer in ways he could not share, could not stop, and could not even understand. To Mortarion, it was Barbarus all over again, but worse. The air aboard his ships turned into a nightmare echo of the mountain fogs he had tried so hard to escape. Breathing became an act of violence. Lungs filled with acidic sludge that refused to clear, no matter how violently he coughed. His armor, once a symbol of his philosophy, became a coffin that trapped the fumes inside with him. The deck stank of bile, rust, and necrotic sweetness. Every corridor felt like the slopes of his childhood. Every step a climb toward an enemy he could not see. Marines staggered past him, wheezing, hacking, leaking filth from the seams of their armor. Yet still, marching because that was what he had taught them. Endure, endure, endure. But this time endurance did not lead to victory. It led only to more suffering. His entire creed, the belief that survival through pain forged unbreakable strength, was being mocked by a plague that treated their resilience as entertainment. Then the plague reached him. It didn't matter that he was a Primarch. It didn't matter that his lungs had survived a childhood on Barbarus. The disease sank into him with intimate familiarity, like a long-forgotten nightmare slipping back into place. His chest tightened. His breath turned to knives. The air, already thin and wrong, thickened into syrup he couldn't pull into his lungs. Every inhalation triggered a chain reaction of spasms that racked his massive frame. His vision swam in pus-smeared colors. The memories came back. Mountain fog, Neker's shadow, the Emperor's silhouette cutting through the poison like it was nothing. He was that child again, staggering through clouds he couldn't breathe, reaching for an enemy he couldn't kill. For all his wars, all his victories, all his hardened philosophy, Mortarion found himself right back where he started, choking in the dark, powerless. It is here that chaos truly moved, not as a roaring temptation, but as a soft, patient, almost sympathetic presence. Nurgle did not come to Mortarion with promises of conquest. Nurgle came with the promise of an end to fear. The voices that seeped into Mortarion's mind were not triumphant. They were warm, amused, almost gentle. They suggested that pain did not have to be a battle, that disease did not have to be a punishment, that decay could be something shared, communal, almost comforting. Nurgle framed rot as acceptance, plague as constancy, entropy as stability. Mortarion, racked with coughing fits that left him barely able to stand, listened despite himself. He had always believed suffering made you stronger. Nurgle offered a different lesson. Suffering makes you his. And in his weakest moment, Mortarion realized that he was tired, not of fighting enemies, but of fighting the same terror over and over again. He was tired of not being able to breathe. As his legion withered, his worldview crumbled. What good was endurance if it only led to this? What good was strength if it could not protect his sons from a plague that laughed at their fortitude? Mortarion's hatred of psychers had no power here. His contempt for warpcraft did not cleanse the air. His stubborn refusal to bend did not unclog a single marine's lungs. The destroyer plague had found the one blind spot in his philosophy. He had never considered the possibility that some suffering does not forge, it only breaks. Faced with that truth, with the sound of hundreds of Death Guard drowning in their own bodies, Mortarion's resolve finally cracked. He did not kneel in some ritualistic chamber. He did not carve symbols into his flesh. He simply stopped resisting the idea that he needed help from something beyond himself. And that tiny surrender was all Nurgle needed. The pact, when it came, was less an oath and more a final exhale. Mortarion did not articulate a contract. He collapsed into one. In the choking dark, he accepted that if the warp was going to take him, it might as well give him the strength to make that surrender mean something. Nurgle surged into him like a disease finally moving from incubation to bloom. Pain inverted into grotesque vitality. His decaying body swelled with impossible endurance. The venom in his lungs turned to a foul, invigorating fog he could breathe forever. Around him, the Death Guard stopped dying, not because the plague was cured, but because Nurgle had claimed it as his work. Their flesh sloughed and then hardened into swollen, diseased armor. Their armor fused with their skin. Their pain became background noise, ever present but no longer unbearable. The Death Guard did not survive the Destroyer Plague. They became its chosen form. Mortarion did not escape suffocation. He evolved into something that no longer needed air. In that hideous metamorphosis, Mortarion gained what he had always wanted: the power to never feel that childhood terror again. But the price was everything else. His disgust for unearned power had led him into the arms of a god who granted power in the most unearned way possible. His hatred of necromancers had turned him into the patron of a legion whose very existence depended on necrotic miracles. His belief in suffering as a test had become a life sentence of eternal decay. What broke him was not chaos itself, but the realization that his philosophy had limits, and instead of accepting those limits, he let the warp rewrite them. From that point on, his path was no longer about freeing humanity from tyrants. It was about making the entire galaxy breathe the same poison that had defined his life, so that no one would ever be able to pretend the universe was anything but rotten at its core. Mortarion's breaking point, then, was not a betrayal in the traditional sense. It was a surrender to the one enemy he had never defeated: his own fear of suffocating, his own memory of helplessness. The warp trap did not lure him with power. It trapped him in a loop he couldn't escape and then offered him a way to stop feeling afraid of it. He took it, and in that moment, the liberator of Barbarus died. Not on a battlefield, but inside a ship full of rotting sons who still believed their Primarch would find a way to save them. He did, just not in the way they had hoped. Chapter 7: Becoming the Prince of Decay. Demonhood and the Fall of a Liberator. What if the moment Mortarion finally achieved the power he had spent his entire life chasing, the ability to exist without pain, to breathe without fear, to stand without the weight of suffocating memories, was also the moment he became the darkest possible version of himself? Mortarion's ascension into demonhood was not the triumphant coronation whispered among corrupted cults. It was the slow, crushing collapse of a man who had built his entire identity around resisting the very kind of power he now embodied. When Nurgle's gift finally took root, Mortarion did not rise with glory. He rose with a grotesque sense of relief, a shameful and sickening comfort that wrapped around him like the poisonous fogs of Barbarus. For the first time in his existence, Mortarion breathed without agony, and that freedom was the final chain that bound him. His lungs, once symbols of struggle and identity, no longer mattered. No more burning, no more choking, no more terror at the taste of poison. The air that had defined his nightmares now clung to him like a familiar friend. His body, bloated and transformed, rejected neither toxin nor decay. Instead, it welcomed them with a perverse vitality that felt both alien and inevitable. It was as if every moment of suffocating fear he had endured as a child on Barbarus had now been inverted into a monstrous immortality, a life where the air itself obeyed him. But that gift came with a price so immense it shattered the last remnants of the man he once hoped to be. The transformation into a Daemon Prince was not a simple reshaping of flesh, but a rewriting of Mortarion's very essence. The pale warrior who had once climbed poisoned mountains now stretched across the sky with wings dripping filth, each beat expelling clouds of spores that fused with the warp. His armor fused into his rotting skin, creating a hideous tapestry of rust and plague. His scythe, once a tool of liberation, became a symbol of Nurgle's dominion, an executioner's weapon infused with virulent diseases that spread reality-warping corruption across entire worlds. Yet the most horrifying aspect of Mortarion's new form was not his monstrous appearance, but his new relationship with suffering. He was no longer shaped by pain. He was now the source of endless, unrelenting agony for others. Mortarion had once believed that endurance was the highest form of strength, that suffering forged truth. But demonhood numbed him to pain entirely, and in that numbness, his philosophy began to rot from within. The pain he once endured with pride became something he could inflict without understanding, without empathy, without restraint. Mortarion's immortality was not simply resilience. It was stagnation elevated to cosmic scale. The Death Guard, bound to him through the Destroyer Plague and the pact that reshaped their bodies, followed him into damnation with no ability to resist. They did not rise as champions. They sagged, bloated, swollen with festering necrosis that refused to kill them. Their armor bulged with organic growths, each plate fused permanently to diseased flesh. Their bolters vomited streams of mucus-filled rounds. Their footfalls left rotting footprints that did not fade. Where once they were the Imperium's unbroken blades, now they were its unstoppable rot, an army whose march was a biological disaster. Mortarion had built the 14 Legion on endurance, teaching them to stand firm against anything. Now, that hardened resilience became their curse, trapping them in eternal putrefaction. Not living, not dead, just enduring forever, an immortal parody of the creed they once believed in. Nurgle's reward for Mortarion's submission was a realm crafted to his image. The Plague Planet, an entire world of horrors that echoed the toxic hellscape of Barbarus but magnified to cosmic scale. Verdant life did not exist there. Instead, forests were built from ossified stalks of bone, their branches dripping with slime. Rivers flowed not with water but with pus and suspended rot. The air hung heavy with spores that whispered through the breeze like mocking ghosts. This was Mortarion's dominion. This was his throne. This was his punishment. The child who once dreamed of freeing humanity from toxic tyrants now ruled a world where nothing breathed freely, nothing grew cleanly, nothing existed without infection. He had become the tyrant he once despised, only far worse, for his power was no longer mortal. Yet in Mortarion's twisted reasoning, he clung to the delusion that he was still teaching the galaxy a truth he had learned on Barbarus. That everything decays, everything suffers, everything ends. He believed he was freeing humanity from the illusion of purity and perfection, revealing decay as the universal constant. Every plague he unleashed, every world he drowned in corruption, every realm he turned into a laboratory of despair was justified through this warped ideology. Mortarion saw disease as honesty, rot as clarity, entropy as freedom. He convinced himself that by spreading plague, he was liberating existence itself from lies. But in reality, he was projecting his trauma onto the galaxy, forcing every living thing to breathe the same nightmares he never escaped. His fall from liberator to tyrant was complete the moment he embraced the twisted comfort of Nurgle's philosophy. The suffering that once defined him became meaningless. The strength he once earned through struggle became irrelevant. The ideals he once fought for dissolved into sludge. Mortarion became the antithesis of everything he once believed, a being defined not by endurance, but by apathy, not by rebellion, but by submission, not by the desire to destroy tyranny, but by the instinct to impose a far worse one. Mortarion's demonhood was not the birth of a god. It was the death of a man who had never been allowed to heal. Even worse, the deeper tragedy is that Mortarion did not see his transformation as a fall. To him, it was clarity. He believed Nurgle had shown him the truth of existence, the final revelation that everything eventually rots, and that embracing decay was the only honest path. In this delusion, Mortarion found purpose, but purpose built entirely upon the ashes of his original ideals. And so he ruled the plague planet not as a monster reveling in chaos, but as a prophet of despair, preaching the gospel of rot with the fervor of a corrupted saint. He had become the perfect servant of Nurgle not because he sought power, but because he sought meaning, and found it in the one place guaranteed to destroy him. Thus, the liberator of Barbarus became the eternal jailer of worlds. The child who suffocated under toxic skies became the demon who reshaped reality so others would suffocate with him. The man who once fought against necromantic overlords became the greatest plague lord the galaxy had ever seen. Mortarion did not simply fall. He decayed, slowly and quietly, until nothing pure remained. His demonhood was not a reward. It was the final, irreversible proof that the Emperor had lost him long before chaos ever claimed him. Chapter 8: 10,000 Years of Rot. The Long War, Plague Legions, and Endless Corruption. What if 10,000 years of existence didn't turn a warrior into a legend, but into a warning, proof that immortality without purpose is just decay stretched across eternity? Mortarion's demonhood did not mark the end of his story. It marked the beginning of a long, grueling stagnation that corroded everything he had ever believed, leaving him trapped in a cycle of war that defied time itself. Once he became the Prince of Decay, Mortarion stepped into a role that the Imperium would come to fear more than any battlefield victory or defeat: the eternal antagonist. The Long War was not a conflict fought in years or campaigns. It was a state of being, a rotting continuum where demon primarchs, corrupted legions, and the warp-twisted horrors of chaos waged a conflict that never ended and never progressed. For Mortarion, the Long War became a prison of purpose, a crusade without direction, an endless repetition of the philosophies that had once shaped him but now only mocked him. He could neither win nor lose. He could only persist, and persistence, stripped of hope, becomes corruption. While other demon primarchs reveled in madness, ascension, or spectacle, Mortarion existed in a grim middle ground, aware enough to feel disdain for his situation, but bound too tightly to escape it. Over millennia, The Death Guard evolved into a legion defined not by their victories but by their inevitability. They did not blitz planets with speed or terror. They infected them slowly, patiently, the way mold claims a forgotten room. Plague fleets drifted into systems like floating graveyards, their hulls swollen with living rust and dripping contagion into the void. Their arrival rarely brought immediate warfare. Instead, it brought silence, followed by the quiet collapse of ecosystems, infrastructures, and the very biological fabric of each world. Entire planets rotted from the inside out before a single bolter was fired. Fields withered overnight. Oceans turned viscous. Cities drowned in spore clouds that made breathing an act of suicide. Mortarion saw in these methods a twisted echo of Barbarus, an entire galaxy forced to experience the same suffocating helplessness he had felt as a child. The Death Guard no longer conquered. They consumed, reshaping worlds in the image of their Primarch's trauma. In every choking cough, in every festering wound, Mortarion saw himself reflected back. Mortarion's personal hatred for Psykers, once rooted in the scars inflicted by necromantic overlords, metastasized into an obsession over the millennia. He despised Psykers not merely because their power felt unnatural, but because psychic ability represented vulnerability. Vulnerability to the warp, vulnerability to influence, vulnerability to the Emperor's luminous presence that had overshadowed him since Barbarus. In demonhood, this hatred twisted into a fanatical belief that Psykers embodied weakness, even though Mortarion himself now existed as a creature sustained entirely by warp energy. He had become the thing he hated, yet he refused to acknowledge it, hiding his hypocrisy behind centuries of bile and denial. This internal contradiction fueled his cruelty. Mortarion targeted Psyker-heavy worlds with special delight, unleashing plagues that specifically attacked neural pathways, mutating psychic auras into spasming storms of pain. Libraries of astropaths were wiped out in hours. Choirs of sanctioned Psykers dissolved in waves of psychic corrosion. The irony was grotesque. Mortarion, once a victim of psychic tyranny, now used his newfound supernatural power to oppress others with the same brutality he had once detested. But even as he spread plague after plague across the Imperium, Mortarion himself began to erode. Immortality, when built on decay, is not a gift. It is slow disintegration stretched into infinity. The plague planet became both his fortress and his cage. He walked halls made from living organs, breathed air heavy with spores and despair, ruled legions of beings who could no longer die, but could never truly live. Each century stripped more of his memory, more of his ambition, more of his identity. The man who had once dreamed of freeing his people now dreamed only of spreading rot because rot was the only truth he still recognized. His past blurred into indistinct recollection. Barbarus became myth even to him. Necair's cruelty faded into instinctual fear rather than memory. The Emperor's intervention became a wound without context, only rage. Over time, Mortarion's emotions decayed into predictable rhythms. Anger, disgust, resentment, emptiness. Hope had long ago dissolved. What remained was a creature defined entirely by the absence of everything he once was. The Death Guard, trapped in the same curse, reflected this spiritual erosion. Their once diverse personalities dissolved into monotony. Their voices became wet, rasping gargles. Their souls dimmed beneath layers of rot. Yet within this eternal degradation, they found something resembling unity. They no longer feared death because death never came. They no longer feared pain because pain was constant and meaningless. They no longer feared failure because every infection was a victory. Their devotion to Mortarion deepened not because he inspired them, but because they were bound to him through the very diseases that hollowed their bodies. Where once they admired him as a champion of endurance and purity of purpose, now they revered him as an avatar of inevitability, a being whose every step brought decay, whose every breath spread corruption, whose presence alone undid the work of civilizations. In their eyes, Mortarion was no longer their Primarch. He was their apocalypse made flesh. Throughout the long war, Mortarion clashed repeatedly with the Imperium, often appearing as an omen of doom rather than a conventional military commander. His methods were not designed for conquest but collapse. When he descended onto a world, it was not to seize territory but to unravel it. Time and again, Imperial commanders assumed Mortarion's goals aligned with Horus' ancient strategy, but they were mistaken. Mortarion's war was not ideological, it was personal. It was always personal. Every planet he infected, every system he drowned in plague, every life he extinguished was another scream aimed at the memory of the Emperor, another attempt to show the galaxy that the values the Imperium preached were lies. Mortarion was not trying to win the long war. He was trying to make the Emperor's dream rot from the inside out. Each corrupted world was a message carved from decay. You failed me, so I will make your galaxy fail you. And yet, beneath all his power, all his corruption, all his hatred, Mortarion remained trapped in a loop he could never break. Every plague he mastered, every world he poisoned, every empire he helped erode only brought him back to the same suffocating truth. He was still that child gasping on the fog-choked slopes of Barbarus, still reaching for a tyrant he could not kill, still yearning for a victory he would never be allowed to claim. His demonhood had elevated his strength, but not his soul. His immortality had freed his body, but imprisoned his mind. The galaxy believed Mortarion was unstoppable, but Mortarion knew the truth. He had not conquered decay. He had become its first and most miserable servant. Thus 10,000 years crawled by, each century identical to the last, each war a repetition of the same bitter lesson. Corruption does not bring enlightenment. It only preserves suffering long enough for the sufferer to forget why they ever fought. Mortarion's long war was not a conquest. It was a slow-motion disintegration of a once proud spirit, stretched across time until nothing recognizable remained except hatred, poison, and the echo of a breath he never truly escaped. Chapter 9, The Emperor's Biggest Failure? Plague Wars, Guilliman, and the Final Judgment. What if the final judgment of Mortarion's tragedy didn't come from chaos, betrayal, or demonhood, but from facing the one brother who exposed everything he had spent 10,000 years trying to deny? When Roboute Guilliman returned from stasis, resurrected through a union of arcane technology and divine intervention, Mortarion felt something he had not felt since Barbarus. A deep, smoldering humiliation. Guilliman's rebirth did more than restore Ultramar. It reopened wounds Mortarion had buried under mountains of rot. Because if one Primarch could return, could rise renewed, could reclaim purpose, then Mortarion's own fall was no longer destiny. It was failure, and failure for Mortarion was a poison more potent than any plague in Nurgle's arsenal. The Plague Wars were not merely a campaign of conquest. They were Mortarion's furious attempt to rewrite his own narrative, to prove that his demonhood was not a collapse of spirit but a triumph of truth. Every plague he unleashed across Ultramar, every hive city he drowned in spores, every field he turned to sludge was his answer to Guilliman's resurrection. A grim declaration that hope itself was a lie. The opening acts of the Plague Wars revealed just how deeply Mortarion's obsession had metastasized. Plague fleets poured through the dark Imperium like drifting continents of rot, trailing clouds of filth that warped reality long before the ships themselves appeared. Mortarion targeted Ultramar not because it was strategic, but because it was Guilliman's domain, the living monument to everything Mortarion despised: discipline, order, progress, hope. Mortarion's hatred was ancient and personal. Ultramar represented the antithesis of Barbarus. Clean cities, healthy citizens, air that nourished instead of suffocated. Guilliman had built a realm where life could flourish, and Mortarion saw this as an insult to everything he had endured. To Mortarion, Ultramar was a lie that needed to be torn apart, because if it were real, then his entire worldview was wrong. As Mortarion descended upon the Loyalist worlds, his presence alone reshaped them. Weather patterns dissolved into clouds of pestilence. Rivers bloated with fungal matter. Children were born old, coughing rot into cradles. Entire continents fell ill in perfect silence, as if their ecosystems simply lost the will to function. Mortarion marched through these dying worlds like a prophet fulfilling ancient scripture, his wings trailing clouds of death. His voice carried across the corrupted air in booming waves of malaise, proclaiming a truth he believed Guilliman and the Imperium had ignored: that decay was the only universal constant, that life was a temporary lie, that endurance required embracing the inevitability of rot. Yet beneath every plague, beneath every corrupted sanctuary, beneath every ruined cathedral lay Mortarion's true purpose, forcing Guilliman to face the same toxic truths he had faced as a child. The Plague Wars were Mortarion's attempt to drag Guilliman into the fog of Barbarus, and prove that even a resurrected Primarch could not survive the poison he once conquered. When Guilliman and Mortarion finally confronted each other, the clash was more than physical, it was ideological. Guilliman represented everything Mortarion believed the Emperor had denied him: clarity, structure, purpose, love without deception. Guilliman fought for the Imperium, for humanity, for the vision their father could not complete. Mortarion fought for the opposite, for entropy, for inevitability, for a universe that matched the suffering of his childhood. Their duel was not a contest of strength, but a collision of wounds. Guilliman's resilience came from rebirth, Mortarion's from trauma calcified into fanaticism. Blade met scythe, light met decay. Guilliman's blows were precise, disciplined, guided by the Emperor's psychic presence that pulsed through the armor and artifacts, empowering him. Mortarion's strikes were fueled by rage, centuries of resentment, and the corrupting gifts of Nurgle that made him a walking storm of sickness. As the battle raged, Mortarion felt something unexpected. Fear. Not fear of death, but fear of being seen. Guilliman saw him not as a monster, not as a demon prince, but as a broken brother. And Mortarion could not bear that reflection. The Emperor's psychic interference shattered Mortarion's composure completely. When Guilliman's aura flared with golden radiance in the final moments of their clash, Mortarion recoiled as if struck by memory itself. The Emperor's presence, distant, silent, but undeniable, ripped through the fog of decay like a sunbeam into a tomb. Mortarion felt again the childhood terror of Barbarus, the moment when the Emperor stole his final victory, the moment he realized he would never defeat his tyrant alone. The same golden light that once saved his life now mocked everything he had become. In that blinding psychic glare, Mortarion saw not Guilliman, but the Emperor's silhouette, and once again, he was the child lying in the poison, choking, helpless, defeated. The Daemon Prince of Decay was reduced to a memory of fear. He fled not because he was beaten in body, but because he was beaten in spirit. Nurgle's laughter followed him, warm, amused, and cruel, echoing across the warp as Mortarion retreated into the shadows of his plague planet. In the aftermath, Guilliman stood as a symbol of renewal while Mortarion sank deeper into bitterness. The Plague Wars did not end Mortarion. They crystallized his tragedy. For 10,000 years, Mortarion had convinced himself that the Emperor had failed him, that he had been abandoned, misunderstood, overshadowed, robbed of purpose. But the truth Guilliman revealed during their confrontation was far more painful. Mortarion had failed himself long before chaos ever touched him. He clung to suffering because suffering gave him identity. He clung to resentment because resentment gave him meaning. He clung to decay because decay was predictable. The Emperor's greatest failure was not losing Mortarion to chaos. It was failing to heal a son who did not know how to exist without pain. And Mortarion's greatest failure was that he never allowed himself to grow beyond the child gasping on Barbarus. So, when historians ask whether Mortarion was the Emperor's biggest failure, the answer is not found in the Plague Wars, nor in the Long War, nor in the heresy. It lies in the quiet truth that Mortarion never escaped the moment that defined him. He began life as a liberator and ended as a tyrant of decay, not because chaos corrupted him, but because he never believed he could be anything else. The universe did not doom Mortarion. Mortarion doomed himself, and in that tragic symmetry, the Emperor's failure and Mortarion's failure became one and the same. Two broken visions intertwining across 10,000 years until neither could be separated from the other.